Welcome everyone to this featured panel, Black Lives Matter in Historical and Transnational Context. I am delighted to be moderating this amazing panel of people, experts, activists from all over the world. And so we're really delighted to have this conversation today. As you know, in 2020, we've lost so many loved ones in the global pandemic because of structural racism. Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other communities of color in the US and around the world were among those who were disproportionately contracting and dying from the disease. And also in 2020, the world was shaken by a series of brutal murders of Black people by the police and white vigilantes. These murders forced the world to confront racial violence aimed at exploiting and oppressing African and African-descended people. In 2020, we had a session on Black Lives Matter, which seemed just in the midst of while it was all happening, and we want to remind everyone, in the midst of this, which is still continuing to happen. And so we decided for this SASE conference to continue this conversation and look at it also from a global and transnational perspective as well. So without further ado, I won't talk anymore. I will turn it over to Donatella de la Porta, who is a professor of political science at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. Thank you.
Thank you, Zophia, very much, and thank you for this invitation. I will talk of a special side of the Black Lives Matter movements, which is related with its spreading to Europe and to Europe in general, but more specifically to Italy. And so a questions that I want to address is, first of all, how did it happen that in the midst of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protest in the United States had such a resonance in Italy, a resonance that previous waves of Black Lives Matter had not had? And then which type of consequences these movements have on the Italian anti-racist movements. So I'm starting with the questions of how did it happen? That's in Italy we had a lot of protest, unexpectedly to a large extent, with the transformative power of this protest. I will address then these events as forms of eventful protest, capable of creating opportunities and resources for activism on these issues. So first of all, what was the background in Italy? It is not a background that is considered traditionally to be, I can say, appropriate for the development of movements. It was not only in the midst of the pandemic, but it was also in a moment in which neoliberalism plus the effects of the pandemic had increased inequalities, had created a lot of emergencies, and had created the fragmentations among peoples of different characteristics. Second element, it happened in the midst of a backlash. Italy, to a certain extent, resonated with the United States in the sense that it was in Europe the countries that most approximated the power of a type of radical rights, like Trump in the United States. In Italy, we had a powerful racist party in power, the Lega. And I think this resonance was important. So usually research on cross-national diffusion says it is important for ideas to diffuse, that movements create, even if they are geographically distant, they create a sense of similarities in a common destiny. And I think in Italy, this happened through this type of identifications of the opponents, Trump in the United States, but also Salvini and the radical right in Italy. But I think it was not just a matter of identifying an opponent. It was also a matter, and I think this is important for cross-national diffusions as well, of developing actors, so existing resources in terms of organized activism that could build upon the wave, that could build upon the examples of the Black Lives Matter in the United States. So in previous research, I talked of eventful protests as kind of critical junctures that develop through a trigger, so a moment of focusing attention, and the demonstrations against the assassinations of George Floyd in the United States were clearly these triggers. But in order for a wave to spread also in other countries, you need a sort of reverberation, a diffusion of these forms of protest. And in Italy, this happened because of some emerging seeds of transformations in the anti-racist movements. So Italy was a country in which colonialism was not thematized much, and the anti-racist movements developed especially as movements of solidarities with migrants. Within a traditional left-wing type of ideologies that considered especially the issues of anti-racism as an issues of equal rights for all. So the anti-racist movements had been emergency-oriented. In other cases of assassinations of Black people by either the police or racists, in solidarity in support of the migrants, direct forms of actions in the attempt to save life in the Mediterranean of migrants who were traveling towards Italy. But it was still a movement that was mainly perceived as a movement of solidarities with people who were suffering. What's happened in Italy with the Black Lives Matters is a sort of capacity of these movements, not only to be to spread ideas that were adopted in Italy, but also to produce adaptation in the sense that the ideas coming from the United States were also actively adapted to the Italian situation. So I think one should reflect on the process of transformations of ideas. The Italian situation resonated with the one in the United States in terms of backlash, but also it was helped, this development, by the presence of paradoxical situations with the pandemic. A sort of COVID-related situations that created attention to what was going on at the global level, with Trump that became the symbol of the most cynical and ineffective responses to the pandemics itself. So which type of channels were used in this process of spreading? The mobilizations happened quite grassroots, quite spontaneously. A lot of actions were built upon the initiatives of small groups of individuals, but they were happening in a very dense environment in which interactions of activists from different countries was quite widespread. And also they happen through the capacity of creating new type of organizations that build also upon the ideas of self-appropriation and acquisitions of protagonism by those who were more directly affected by episodes of racism. So this was not totally new. It had happened already in 2015 during the so-called long summer of migrations, but with in the summer of 2020, it took a new type of energy. And what spread, what traveled? Repertoires of actions, the symbolic performances in Italy were very much taken from the examples in the United States, the genuflections, the type of symbolic reflections of colonialism also in Italy. But it also developed with participatory and deliberative forms through open mics during sit-ins and attempts to involve the people who were more directly suffering from the racism in Italy and elsewhere. Second thing which spread was ideas, and especially in the Italian context, the ideas of reappropriation and resistance to the backlash were linked to the issues of Blackness and colonialism. And this, as I mentioned, is quite new in a context in which anti-racism was previously colorless to a large extent. Finally, in order not to take too much time, I think it is important to reflect on what remained from these movements. So which consequences, what is sedimenting in the process. And here I think we have important repercussion that I think are there to stay. One is in terms of frames. A Black protagonism that had not been a characteristic of the anti-racist movement in Italy in the past. And that's implied also the broadening of the movements, not only to migrants, but also to Italian people of colors. That's implied also debates within the movements about the essence of the collective identity itself. At the organizational level, also the creation of new local groups is a legacy of these moments with these grassroots and very horizontal characteristics. And finally, at the level of the repertoires of actions, I think this cultural and symbolic type of protest that developed by the dozens and the hundreds in Italy were quite quite an adaptation. On the one hand, to the measures to contain the pandemics, but also to the reflections on the importance of the cultural dimension for the development of the anti-racist movements. So final 2 minutes on challenges and dilemmas. The Italian movements developed in a very horizontal way and a very localized way. The local rootedness was also emphasized by the activists as an important element for the development of the movements. But this was also seen as at times in tension with an aspirations of networking at the national level and the transnational level. So this developments of protest at the grassroots level is there, but the capacity to construct the movements is still an open question. Second element of tensions at the level of the framing is between specific claims on which the movements was even successful at times, like changing the names of some important places that were named after known racist and colonialist people. But between these specific claims and more broader political identities, the debate is open on the issues of what is the main basis for a collective identities that goes beyond specific groups and is able to create common share identities. And finally, there is the dilemmas about the type of political representation and capacity of the movements to go from protest into social change. And this, I think, is also a general problem for Italian politics. But I will stop here because I see my 15 minutes are just over and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Donatella, for that really rich discussion. I'm sure we'll have many questions at the end. Our next speakers are Karen and Sabrina, and Karen Taylor is the chair of the European Network Against Racism, and Sabrina Zajak is the head of Department Consent and Conflict at the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, and a professor at the Faculty of Social Science at the Ruhr University. So I will now turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you. I will start and then Karen will follow up. Can I share the screen for a presentation? Because I would like to share some of the slides and results from a research project we had. And I will only share the part from the results on Germany, and Donatella was also in this broader project, and I'm speaking on the behalf of the whole team DECIM and also from colleagues of the University in Duisburg-Essen. So I will also talk about resonance of Black Lives Matter's mobilization last year and anti-racist mobilization a little bit broader, and also because it's a common standard concept in social movement studies, but I also wanted to make reference to Hartmut Rosa's debate with Sigrid just right before that one. So basically, BLM has been debated a lot why it created so much resonance, and in particular public resonance. And I really would like to move a little forward because I would like to show you our empirical results on a study we did for 6 months last year to measure this a little bit. And if you would like to explain public resonance, there are a couple of factors you always look at, and Donatella talked about them also before for the case of Italy. So size and scope matters, the strategies and the framing matter, and the context and the mobilizing histories matter. And so I would like to give you some of the insights we found along those dimensions. And in Germany, the protest was the most widespread in contrast to some other countries we were looking at, including Italy, which was also large, but not as large, or Poland or Denmark. And it wasn't only focused on the big cities, but we saw it also on smaller cities. So it was very widespread, vast, and across different localities. And we used standard newspaper research and looking on the and reports on the number of protesters by week, as the slide on the right, in contrast to the different countries, and in total. And there we see that actually it was a relatively huge protest, which came to a surprise at that time. The frames, there were similarities to Italy, but also differences. So we saw links to the US as well, the solidarity, the emotional collectors, the anti-Black racism, but also always stressing anti-Black racism is not only a US problem, it's also about police violence. But these are aspects Karen will tell you more about it later. But I think what we saw also in the public debate that Black Lives Matter was very successful in framing that we cannot deny racism in Germany and Europe and globally any longer, and linking it and saying, actually, hello, Germany has also a colonial past. And I guess a lot of people in Germany have no clue, literally no clue. They don't know that racism is a structural and institutional problem. And actually that we have multiple varieties of racisms in Germany. Yeah, and anti-Black racism is a particular form of racism within Germany. And here a little bit of photos of a context of also why maybe, or in which path Black Lives Matters activists appeared. So the picture on the left and the top, that was not during the pandemic, that was the year before, the biggest anti-racist mobilization we, I think, ever had in Germany, of Welcome United. And the other two are from protest events during the pandemic of Leave No One Behind. So this was where you saw online or without mass protests. And then with the first opening Black Lives Matter protest. So there was a huge anti-racist mobilization already going on in that time. And yet, nevertheless, debates on racism are in a way new or presumed new, because otherwise we talk about right-wing populism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, but the word racism for Germany is scary, to put it mildly, in the public, or has been, yeah, despite a long and violent history of racism. Yeah? For example, the killing of migrants, as in the events of Hanau just in 2002, but you can go back in time. But we don't know a lot about the long time media debate on racism. And I will just show you a little bit of pictures, because we did a data analysis of a quantified data analysis of 90,000 articles within over a period of 20 years. And which is interesting is that in this whole discursive field on racism, actually, there was a long debate, and we just made the cut because we went back in time for 20 years. But this debate, and I couldn't, this was done by data people, I couldn't change it from German to English, but the first peaks you saw when right-wing parties came up and were discussed. For example, we wanted to ban the national right-wing party at one stage. And later on, the year 2011, the National Socialist Underground, the far-right extremist terrorist attacks happened. So we saw a history of debates going on, but these were framed, and you can't see it here in detail, but these were framed with a little different terms. The term racism really peaked in the end. And another thing I do want to share, we looked for actors in the debate, and we see that, and this is only for the political parties, that in the end, in the last years, the debate, the existing debate on racism was, at least to some extent, also involved or surrounded from people from the IFD. And we have a lot of more data on this media resonance, but I just wanted to give this short glimpse before handing over now to Karen, to show yes, we saw a lot of resonance, a lot of media resonance, and it does impact the debate, but also that many actors dominate the debate, and it is still very strongly, the debate is such dominated by right-wing actors. Yeah? And we see a lot of non-resonance, in particular of certain frames, which I call silence. And we see a lot of other spheres of resonance. The impact of activism is much, much broader than only the media. But maybe this is the good start for Karen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina, and also thank you for the invitation to this discussion. I would like to pick up from what the impression of this movement and the sparks of this movement within the German Black community now is, and what the outcomes will be. So picking up from what Sabrina just said, there was a huge media resonance, but the backside or the downfall of this media resonance was, and that was is an impression shared by a lot of activists that I'm in contact with, is we went 5 steps back. Oh, sorry, that's the little one. We went 5 steps back in the discussion about racism. So when activists were contacted from media outlets, the first question was, do we actually have racism in Germany? Do you experience racism yourself? So things that were actually stated. We have a National Action Plan Against Racism that was passed by the German government. We have a Forum Against Racism, which is consisted of activists, organization which work on anti-racism, and the government. So there are settings in place which do address racism. So it's not something which just appeared in last year, but the questions from the media, so that there's definitely a downside to all this attention, the questions from the media went 5 steps back. So that is definitely where I would say a negative outcome of the sudden spark of the Black Lives Matter movement. Sabrina mentioned it as well. The movement itself didn't develop across from last year, but we actually were in line with the foundation of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. This is also when we had the development of different chapters, German chapters and statewide chapters of the Black Lives Matter movement here in Germany as well. So the fight itself is not a new one. What was new was that young actors joined the movement, and I believe Donatella said it too, that a lot of young activists tried to join, and whereas in Italy they faced the issue or the challenge of organizing, here in Germany they fell on a ground, I would say, of a lot of activists that were able to assist or to give advice or to just be there for the younger ones. But I will have to say, and I give a lot of credit, the biggest demonstrations that were organized in Cologne, in Berlin, for example, were not organized by the old activists, but by the young new generation. Then another outcome that the grassroots movement is hoping for, and development we saw, is that for the very first time, for the second time, we were readdressing racial profile. We had a discussion in the early 2000 years with a case stating that racial profiling was illegal in Germany. And after this discussion in the early 2010, we had a backfall across the parties stating that racial profiling in some instances was necessary. And now having this violence and police brutality, there is now a clear statement again that we need to address racial profiling, we need to address police violence, and we need the data, because for now there's been a lot of talk about police violence being an individual and a subjective impression and alone. Maybe I'll stop here. And I'll come back, and I'm there for questions because I just wanted to talk about police violence and the discussion about race, not seeing race in the debate. So I'll come back.
Thank you so much. Yes, we can definitely come back. We can definitely circle back. And we really, again, appreciate all these amazing insights and the multitasking that we're all that's going on right now. Thank you so much, Karen and Sabrina. And so now I will turn to our next presenter. Let me just, sorry, I have a million screens up. So our next presenter is Christopher Harris, and he is at Northwestern University in African American Studies.
Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation and the opportunity for the conversation. I'm going to do something a little bit different, which is to say, provide a kind of a theoretical framework to not only think about the uprisings last year, but to put those uprisings in kind of a historical context from which we might also think about the future. Excuse me. So I'm going to be reading a piece that I co-authored with Dr. Marissa Solomon, who is at Barnard. And it's called Black Grammar, Repertoires of Abolition's Future, Present, and Past. COVID-19 caused a moment of global captivity. Differently ensnared under stay-at-home orders, the pandemic proved uneven in its impact. Higher infection and fatality rates laid siege to Black communities across the US, indexing, once again, the precarity of Black life and our proximity to premature death. Just as Blackness preceded those unnamed bodies disproportionately lost to the virus, it likewise preceded Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, whose murders were shadowed in similarly horrific fashion by the minutes-long refrain of George Floyd's dying pleas. So while forced to shelter in place, the mathematics of anti-Blackness, the numbers, narratives, tolls, and ledgers, marked 2020 as a future archive in the making, a counting of the dead in repetition that, quote, provides the conditions through which Black history will be told and studied, end quote. In opposition to the racialized violence of enclosures, the socio-spatial patterns and regimes of knowledge that structure our lives, precipitate and tally our deaths, we sought strategies to think and write about Black livingness, ways to affirm the resistance in and of Black life. So it's not by chance we found ourselves immersed in C.L.R. James' account of the San Domingo Revolution in the Black Jacobins, days before the Black-led uprisings began. The 12-year-long rebellion that created Haiti contested the institutions of thought, governance, and exploitation that undergirded the white supremacy of colonialism and enslavement. James's radical priority of the colony made Black struggle central as opposed to peripheral to European history and his own historical present. So by writing an account of revolution for revolution, he pointed to a decolonial, anti-capitalist future that had not yet happened, a heretofore Black future. So to read the Black Jacobins is to be reminded that the legacies of anti-Blackness that kill us in our homes and on our neighborhood streets, legacies that make brutal the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for our communities, is also a legacy of the insurgent desire to move while confined. Moving, thinking, and writing towards liberation demands holding on to its tenets, what would have to have happened, itself a Black knowledge of not only the present political and social constellation, but the ruptures that produced it. So just as many Black radicals encountered, developed, and pronounced revolutionary thought while held captive, we too met the Black Jacobins while enclosed. Freedom fighters who continue to revolt, who we have already met many times over. Theirs is the spirit of world-making incumbent to the Black radical tradition, or what we're calling Black grammar. Black grammar is an inherited repertoire of rebellion prescriptive of a future yet to come. It brings into focus the shape, scope, and historical antecedents of last year's uprisings as examples of Black livingness, something we do and learn by doing, a way to apprehend the demand to defund the police in the same breath as the battle for San Domingo. While this repertoire is a longstanding mode of survival, it is also a call, an index, a vision that insists not on the reform of the current world, but rather the end of it. Building on and channeled through a shared heritage, we see Black grammar as synonymous with the praxis of abolition, quote, a dream towards futurity vested in insurgent counter-civilizational histories, genealogies of collective genius that perform liberation under conditions of duress, end quote. In other words, Black grammar is and has always been a fugitive response to the enclosures erected by property and profit, enclosures to which Black bodies are relegated but also critique, disfigure, and dismantle with Black joy. While grammar names the structural rules that outline the parameters of a language, it also details the study of what language enables, how it is used, what it performs, and its multimodal plying of space to speak out something else. So this presentation is a meditation on the tools of rebellion, those illegible to the master, for we know his tools will not dismantle the house from which he accrues his benefits. Amid ongoing Black struggle, we draw attention to how Black grammar, as practiced and performed during the uprisings, prefigures liberation, toppling monuments, burning buildings, singing, shouting, dancing, where we know we're not supposed to be. The freedom dreams exploding again onto our streets. We elevate these tools, defacement and revival, forged to the captivity, enabling us to speak, demand, and conjure the end of white supremacy. Our intention is to make room for these acts, to allow them to teach us about the now, what has always been, and a predicate future in which the mattering of Black life is the horizon. Fashioned in what Christina Sharp has termed the total climate of anti-Blackness, this grammar is not bound by words. Instead, it opens up the numerous refusals that Black people spontaneously use and collectively share in the face of the current order of things, of racial capitalism, heteronormativity, and the liberal state, of a world incapable of care and concern for all Black life. Black grammar names how we use tools, not a complete range of what those tools are. It outlines the terrain of their deployment when in open rebellion against white sense, the everyday language of law and order, civility, reform, and progress that shield the racial violence necessary to maintain what Barnard Hesse calls white sovereignty. So the protests that erupted in the aftermath of George Floyd's state-sanctioned murder left tremors around the world, as we've been discussing. With them, images of broken windows and burned out buildings circulated. One such image of a Nike store in the Bronx came coupled with the caption, "Fire set, windows smashed, stores looted, New York City, day 4." By captioning and capturing Black protests as looting, political pundits recuperate violent police repression as peacekeeping and a necessary response to restore order. These captions are instructions for how white sovereignty authorizes specific readings of Black movement. They are a ledger, the calculus of property subordinate to Black life, superordinate to Black life, excuse me. In other words, they make white sense of Black destruction. They teach us how property is a public pedagogy under racial capitalism, requiring police violence to uphold. While racial terror of policing authenticates this reading, it also obscures how Black destruction critiques sovereignty's calculus and the racializing project of protecting property by subverting white sense. So under slavery, whiteness consolidated itself around the economic logic of legal personhood that definitionally enshrined enslaved persons as things to be possessed. During Reconstruction, the legal protections afforded to white landowners re-enslaved Black persons as convicts, ensuring Black people were not only criminal, but property of the state. In the wake of the Great Depression, the enduring Black poverty cleaved by the New Deal's redlining would further yoke Black dispossession to Black criminalization. And this tethering expanded the modes through which the state, private prisons, and other businesses, i.e. the prison industrial complex, profit off of the Black body's shifting states of captivity. These examples demonstrate that property is required to bring white ownership into being, and that control over the Black body is central to ensuring its teachings. Amidst political unrest, meditations on the ethics of looting remind us how central protecting property is to protecting whiteness. Black protest is thus a threat to the common sense order of white dominion and its violent quotidian erasures. For non-white bodies subject to the mandates of property, statues of slave traders and conquistadors, police precincts, and the steps of City Hall materialize inscriptions that naturalize oppression into the public domain. Destruction, then, is not just an irrational act or a result of mob mentality. Toppling monuments to enslavers and colonizers is a way of challenging the reigning economy of speech about whose history matters. A nascent political communication tagging and bloodying statues of Christopher Columbus is a form of rewriting that forces us to reread the role of conquistador humans and their other genocidal figures. As a form of writing, defacing the pedagogy of property upends the grammars of whiteness. Black life and death are not just punctuation marks within liberal inscriptions, inclusions, or progressive white futures. Black writing and its grammar seeks to tear at the seams of a world written with sentences that foreclose endings and Black beginnings. Thinking from the formative and inherited enclosures of white sense, white property, white order, white preservationists, and white grammar, asks us to attune our reading to the tenses of living as if, or, quote, the politics of prefiguration that involves living in the future now, end quote. Black protest attacks and thus critiques regimes of property central to white supremacy's material formations, territory, and monument. So by defacing the whiteness of public pedagogy, not only do these acts refuse the conditions and presumed authority of how we speak the world into being, they challenge the reigning economies of appropriate speech and the latent expectation of how change is supposed to come. The burning of the US Embassy in Athens, Greece, the sinking of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston into the River Avon in Bristol, and the toppling statue of George Washington tagged and wrapped in a burning US flag in Portland, Oregon, are all prescriptive speech acts for abolition. On the global scale, these acts situate the abolition of the police alongside a critique of imperialism and the injuries of racial capitalism. As techniques of defacement, Black grammar reframes looting as collective declarations about the presence of the past and the agentic annihilation required to bring a different future into being. This structure of speaking violates the rules of civilized grammar, of course, the appropriate way to ask for change in the forms or kinds of volition for, quote, that which will had to have happened, end quote. It is located in the tradition of the creation of sentences that could not be anticipated that violated the rules within the site of grammar, as Hortense Bonas tells us. But if defacement is an act swung in service to an alternative future, so are the moving hips, gestures, and chants of Black-led movement building that resonated through the streets. Singing and dancing, the euphoric fashions of revival, reflect techniques of the body that serve as co-conspirators to anger, rage, and the necessity of destruction. So along with defacement, we understand revival to be part of Black grammar's habit memory, the knowledge of being a body of a certain kind, a Black body once bought and sold, wherein, quote, the past is not pictured as such, but sedimented and structural. An ancestral tradition cultivated in cotton fields and slave cabins, the alchemy of Black protest transforms music and dance into a promise of freedom. It recasts Black joy as an experiment with liberation. These ecstatic rituals of sound and motion, or the insistence on movement, signify a world outside the corporal protocols of white sense. They conjure stories brimming with fugitive knowledge, archived in the reservoir of Black social life that radically reimagined politics and sociality. As a counter-narrative to those sanctioned by the state, tales of the multifaceted artifact of Black communal resistance and resilience defy a political order premised on Black dispossession, subjugation, and death. Their shape and character herald the minor key sensibilities and ethical commitments that will enable the world we build, quote, in and on the ruins of this one, end quote. In other words, we see the joy evident in the uprisings, the variety and spontaneity of its forms as a roadmap and prelude authored by the ungovernable. It prefigures what is yet to come, just as it announces what has always been here. So videos demonstrating the range of performance during the protest bear witness to this duality, and I'm sure you've seen some of them. They testify to the insurgent genealogies of Black life and culture, revivals of power and possibility. So at a march in Chicago, the bombastic blare of trombones led a second line of knee-high steps and shouts, recalling the participatory parade custom that has long been a space for, quote, articulation of local subjectivities, end quote, in Black New Orleans neighborhoods. During a rally in front of City Hall, revelers in Atlanta bopped in a hip-hop beat based on a Black woman's defiant taunt, "You about to lose your job." In doing so, they reinscribe the sonic texture of oppositional speech that links hip-hop to the blues and elevates the divine character of Black idioms and expressions. Summoning Black celebration spirit, protesters from Brooklyn to Los Angeles refashioned the city landscape into a backyard cookout by doing the electric slide and other line dances popular within the Black intramural. So while exploding here and now, the refusal enacted through these willful embraces of joy are nonetheless acts of remembrance. To take a vivid example, a young girl in Puerto Rico moved to the percussive spontaneity of the bamba, a drum-back shake rooted in slavery to a bevy of onlookers. Like the other moments of revival, her performance registers how Black communicative motion and form is inherited, a call and response that exceeds temporality. Unbounded, embodied, and diasporic, the choreographies of resistance within and across the uprisings announce the past, present, and future tense of Black grammar. They demonstrate that abolition names a praxis, a long-stayed striving, as much as it outlines parameters for the unseen. And I'll close with this. All Black protest is a protest of Black death. Whether it is the demand to defund the police or the hidden transcripts used to communicate in the slave quarters of San Domingo, these repertoires of expressive action are political speech that carries forth the cause of another world. Marginalized people's communication under a violent hegemonic order is often illegible, what has elsewhere been termed infrapolitics. Expressive action, especially those deeply embedded in Black political and cultural practice, are not immediately understood as political, precisely because they rest outside of the sense-making terms of white sovereignty. White sovereignty accrues through the repetition of racial violence. It not only demands that Blackness is a problem of law and order, but that the protection of property is pedagogically central to the preservation of white citizenship and democracy. Black grammar rejects the basis of this logic, insisting instead that a Black future is not yet here. Moving while captive is an inherited form of subversion that conveys the future we want to come. Chanting, dancing, singing, and shouting demonstrate laterally amongst ourselves a knowledge of what is possible. Black joy then is a practice and method of refusing the repetition of Black death, the numbers and narratives that mark the mathematics of anti-Blackness and fill the archives of the diaspora. It is a way to honor the dead and dying, to, quote, avenge the suffering of our ancestors with revivals that celebrate Black life, end quote. Doing so openly and in the streets while flanked by police and riot gear defies the sanctity of the state and its action in the name of safety. It is a performance that prefigures their demise. In that sense, if infrapolitics create deviant communion under a white police state, then the Black grammar of abolition is also a politics of prefiguration that allows us to write, read, and live out the future now. Towards this end, disfiguring private or state-owned property clears a path for rewriting space, how we mark time, and whose history matters. White sense assumes that the current order of things is capable of promoting our livelihood. This logic also presumes Black struggle can act as a corrective to white sovereignty, and that its violent enforcement needs just a bit of adjusting. But our blood, our labor, our sacrifice has taught us that the normalized and accepted language of reform, civility, and progress, the ease with which people call for law and order, shields the terror necessary to maintain white sovereignty in an anti-Black world. Black grammar allows us to hear people's demands for something else. Abolition, not just in America, but globally. So as they were in 1804, the Black Jacobins are on our streets right now. It was the people, James teaches us, tearing at the seams of white sense. Quote, they burned San Domingo flat, so at the end of the war, it was a charred desert, end quote. They rewrote history, and in doing so, rewrote the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for that really important and moving intervention. At this point, I don't know if we want to circle back to Karen's comments, if Karen is there, or Melissa Nobles. I just want to check to make sure that if you're okay. So what we can do is then open up for questions, because I think Karen could then jump in to respond or continue her comments in one of her responses. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand. It's a few of us, or you can indicate in the chat that you have a question. I'll keep the queue going. And so who wants to go first?
I have a question for Karen, which might also give her an opportunity to circle back to some of the things that she was saying, if she's available. And if not, maybe Sabrina could.
Karen, yeah. Karen, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, great. So Karen, in your remarks, you mentioned that in the uprisings last year, there were one of the things that was unique about it in Germany and possibly in Italy as well was the presence of a newer generation. But you also indicated that there was, a Black-led movement infrastructure already in place in Germany. So I was wondering, and you suggested that that was the older generation. So in the US, in the Black Lives Matter movement, it's largely throughout from 2013 to now has largely been run by and led by youth. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the demographic or generational differences in Germany and how it's come to bear in the sustaining infrastructure and movement toward younger people as the uprising took place last year.
Thank you. This is a very, very crucial question for our communities, because maybe if I can give some context on that, we have our oldest Black organization in Germany, the initiative, or one of the oldest, it's not, there are different organizations, but it's the biggest, the one that is well known would be the Initiative for Black People in Germany. And the counterpart of that organization is ADEFA, which is a Black feminist organization, and even older than the ISD, the Initiative for Black People in Germany. Both were inspired by African American, by Black American activists coming to Germany and having the Berlin years. So Angela Davis is one person who's been very inspiring. We have descendants from African Americans, Maya Yim, for example. So there are there are strong ties, very strong ties. Dubois is someone who also spent time in Berlin as well. So there are very strong ties from the German discourse, from the German activist-led movements to the American one. So that being said, we had our first uprising in 2013 as well, with the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, which was also steered by a younger generation which wasn't active in these old structures that I talked about, not active in the ISD, not active in ADEFRA and other organizations that came across. So we kind of have a gap between the generations, and the younger, I would say I'm in the middle. I'm not younger anymore. but I'm not old. So I'm kind of in the middle, and that's why I said this question is a crucial one for our organizations. There's somehow that we don't learn from the older generation. There hasn't been that connection, which actually showed that the struggles that is there have been fought by the older generation. And this is really something that people are now coming to see and are trying to work on, and trying to not just see themselves as a generational movement, but as a cross-generational movement. And I kind of feel like that the uprisings from last year triggered that a lot, triggered people actually wanting to exchange and coming together. And it was also the older generation that saw the risk of a possible backlash from the uprising last year, and who also warned or gave advice to the younger generation how to appear on media, for example, what to say, what not to say, all of these kind of stuff, things that they learned and just wanted to share.
Thank you. I think we have another question from Jacqueline O'Reilly.
Hi, well, first of all, thanks everybody for some fantastic session. I hope we can carry on this discussion next year in Amsterdam. I've got one question, I suppose. One of the things I constantly encounter and have done since about 30, 40 years ago when I was doing my PhD, why is it in the UK, we can talk about ethnicity, but when we go to continental Europe, this seems to become a synonym for migration. So the concept of second generation people of colour and different ethnic backgrounds, they're always called migrants. So in my case, my parents are Irish, so I'm second generation Irish according to my mum, but according to other people, I'm British. But for on continental Europe, we can't seem to associate having like what we call in the UK Black British. In Germany, I have colleagues who are really actively involved in the Schwarze Deutsche Verein. So I'm sure many of you know it. And some of those in Germany, the idea of having Black Germans was like an oxymoron. Like, how could that be? I mean, they're just, Germans are naturally white. So part of that Black movement in Berlin and other places in Germany was really to draw attention to those communities. So I suppose my question in some ways maybe targeted at Donatella, because I know she's worked so much on this, but not just at Donatella, at the other projects here. Why is it in Anglo-Saxon cultures, let's call UK and US, we can talk about ethnicity, but in continental European cultures, we can't? I mean, I know there's a history here, but I'd like to hear what you guys think of it.
Do you want me to address this question, Zophia?
Yeah, Donatella, yeah. Do you want to have a go first of all?
Yes, no, I think it is a very important question also in the development of the anti-racist movements. So we have in Italy a specific situations, of course, that is different from the French one, but more similar, I would say, to the German one. It is a country that has a colonial history, but this colonial history is not as I can say acknowledged as it is in France, for instance, because it is a colonial history of a minor type of colonial power. But I think that in general, it is true that in Europe, the anti-racist movement has been moving towards avoiding the terms racism, the terms race altogether. So denying racism has been in the past related with the sort of denial of the specific characteristics of ethnic type of discrimination. And this is the case not only in Italy or in Germany, but it is the case also in France, where there is a large component but of ethnic, widespread ethnic groups that are also rooted in the history, in the colonial history of France, but where the terms race is not used in the same ways as in the UK. In Italy, I think what emerged with the Black Lives Matter is that Italians of colors are very belongs to different groups, because they start to be second generations migrants with Italian citizenship, but these are still small in numbers. There are adopted children, so often the class background of these children is more middle class or even upper class, but they ethnically belong to Italian of colors, and there are migrants, and the migrants are the largest components. So Jack is not that all migrants are Black, and not that all Black Italians are migrants, but the largest type of solidarity movements has been more focusing on the issues of migration than the issues of ethnic characteristics. And I think there it is the bridging of colonial past and fascist past. So after fascism, the fight against discriminations has been also including the denial of the use of race as a point, as say, collective point of identification. But I think there is also another issue which is relevant, and I refer to Christopher's questions about the characteristic of the generational characteristics of the movements, which was in Italy as well very young, but it also interacted with other movements presented in Italy, which were also starting to mobilize on ethnic type of discriminations, but also bridged with other topics. So in Italy, the resistance to the backlash in terms of racist Lega in power, the racist Salvini's party in power, was moved especially by activists working on gender issues, activists working on solidarity with migrants, and also activists working on resisting repressions. And this had meant also the killing of white Italians, so by the police. So all these elements made for a discourse that was intersectional to a large extent, but also I think much aware of the issues of class and social discrimination as well. And this, I think, is a cultural characteristics of the movements in Italy. In comparison with Germany, I think that one difference is more generally related with the ways in which social movements develop in Germany. In Italy, much more horizontal. In Germany, with more of an impact of the culture of recognitions of associations and so on.
Can I briefly add on this categorization question, because we are right now in our research center where we try to measure racisms in Germany at the heart of this debate, and it's a fierce and strongly contested debate if and how to measure different categorizations of social groupings. And we talk a lot with different people from civil societies, and I mean, there is still this strong fear. For example, if you talk to the Sinti and Roma community and others, in this singling out means and making and trying to measure something and quantifying something as a fascist practice, and the fear of being so not the direct immediate fear, but there's this history and distrust of the state, and this is something you simply cannot do, and there is a strong tradition on that. And on the other hand, there are strong pushes for trying to make more differentiations, but then it becomes so contested. So we developed different scales and just tested them. So we didn't do and measure, but we just proposed on how to do and categorize different groups, and it produced a strong shitstorm from so many different angles and so many different areas and groupings and positions in society. So yeah, it's a strong and important point, but we see where the whole debate will be going, or the practice, not only the debate, the practice. I mean, we had a commission on integration, and they for 2 years they were debating this issue, and they decided now to call, not use the word migrants or migration background, but people with history of migration. I can't now directly.
Like in Europe has had a history of migration, or that would cover the 900% of the population of the United States then.
Exactly. So yeah, and it was a 2-year-long debate, and they weren't able to solve it. Yeah,
without dominating. I mean, I do really care about this, because when I was doing my PhD and I was in France, I asked a question at the end of my questionnaire: what ethnicity are you? You know, black, white, Asian, etc. And my supervisor at the time said to me, "Are you a racist? Why do you want to know?" And I said, this is a question we have in the Office of National Statistics in the UK. It's a government endorsed categorization wanting to measure different people's responses. And it was just, I was just really shocked by being confronted by that, because in the UK we took it for granted. And I think Christopher's contribution here is really interesting, talking about a grammar of race or blackness, because how is that grammar constructed? In your case, you're talking about in the context of the United States, largely, it sounds like. I mean, how those grammars are constructed in our own diverse European languages. Well, you just showed how challenging it is, and you've given some answers, so I'll shut up now. But I thank you for this. Is a really, really interesting and very original debate going on here. It's just in the way the whole ideas are being expressed and discussed. So thank you very much for that. Unless, of course, you want to add to it, go ahead.
All right. Well, I think it also brings up this point around sort of how different states deal, you know, erasure, the oppression of erasure, right? Erasing racialized populations, and the tension between the assertion that Black Lives Matter in whatever articulation that takes. Christopher talks about the Haitian Revolution, but also when this happens in France, when this happens in Germany, or across, when this happens in Brazil, and then how states respond to the assertion that Black Lives Matter with, you know, clear trying to erase in different kinds of way, even the category of race, that race exists. So I think that's a very interesting point. Our next, we have Laura, and then Donatella, and then Sigrid. So let Laura go first.
Yeah, thank you everybody for your rich presentations. That was super interesting. And my question is a follow-up on Christopher's question that he posed to Karen, because I was also curious while you talked about this generational component. So I was wondering if you compare the different cases or countries that we heard about here, how is that the case in Italy? How is the demographic composition, but then also in the US, who is mobilizing? So in all the countries, I was wondering, and then in the US also from 2013 to today, is there a generational trajectory? Is it the same groups organizing mostly, or the same demographic composition? So I would be curious to compare the cases. Thanks.
I can answer that question briefly as it pertains to the US. One of the most dynamic things I think about, or one of the more dynamic things is about the current movement for Black Lives, is the fact that although it's largely millennial and younger, there's a lot of intergenerational discourse. So the organization that I was a part of, the Black Youth Project 100, made it an important point in building movement and building organizations, to learn from our elders, to consult from our elders, to have our elders intervene in moments of conflict. So again, while the composition of the primary organizations that get associated with, say, the movement for Black Lives are younger, mid-30s down, or I guess we're all getting older now, but it is definitely textured by an important dialogue and respect for those who had been in movement before.
Still addressing Jacqueline's questions, I think it is a broad and more general ways in which in continental Europe, especially the left has addressed issues of ethnicity. I was thinking about the debate we had in Italy on the self-allocation of people in South Tyrol, which is a region in which there is a large German minority. And the activists on the left, both of German language and of Italian language, were against this categorization, saying we have to adopt a universalistic discourse. In the debate on Black Lives Matter in Italy, this emerged also in groups of Black people who didn't want to use the label of Black Lives Matter for their own organizations. They said, we respect it, but we don't want to have the responsibility to import a conception that may resonate less with the new universalistic visions. More concretely, the debate, for instance, emerged about who is suffering more, and it adopted child of color that lives in a bourgeois family and has citizenship, or a migrant from Albania, for instance, who is white but has no citizenship rights, and or an illegal or paperless migrants of another regions with white colors. These were debates that were developed also in the movements, and that I think reflected these different visions, about which I don't want to assess which one is better or not, because I think they're rooted in history. But I've studied comparative analysis of discriminations in movements in France and in the UK, where also in the global justice movements, for instance, people of colors and migrants were discriminated against. The arguments were very different, and the ways in which people organized in France was based on different assessment of how to develop inclusive type of identities. I also wanted to to answer to Nancy's questions. We did protest event analysis. We didn't do surveys in the project with Sabrina, so we don't have data exactly on age. We may have in the future, but the impression was that there were many demonstrations that were organized by people belonging to very young generations of the one that were reported. People also in part because they built upon the Fridays for Future movement that had also an understanding of climate justice and so on. And so young people were very present. But we don't have data from surveys.
Thank you. Sigrid, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask about, I mean, I'm not sure what to call it, maybe a tension that is there, that between, you know, the collective identity formulated as Black Lives Matters, and then the collective identity that can underlie anti-racist movements, because I mean, anti-racism, or I mean, a protest against racism can come from Black people and from other people, right, that are treated racist because of their different ethnicities or imagined ethnicities. So, and from Christopher's very impressive intervention, I heard that you know, the history of slavery and this kind of common fate was, I mean, maybe I misread it, but was very strong in defining this identity. And I think that is, to me, it sounds like it's kind of different in European countries. And it's partly there in what Karen said. But I mean, even if you take the people of Black people in Germany, or Black people in the UK, or people of color, let's say, in France, I mean, their history is, I mean, you can all bring it back to colonialism somewhere in the end. But I mean, the collective experience history and how it's told is kind of different, right? And I mean, I'm bringing this up because it seems to me also relevant in the formation of the movements. You know, to what extent are there then links to other movements of people of other colors, let's say, in the US, and that we have in Europe this combination of really breaking it up as a combination of organizations of Black people, but also other anti-racist protests. I mean, that's how I heard the presentation of Karen, Sabrina, and Donatella about Italy and Germany of these movements. So I wanted to hear your views on that, also maybe from an American perspective, and does that, I mean, obviously there can be then tensions in the movement, because I mean, on the one hand, you want to keep this kind of perceived collective identity. On the other hand, there are also things that can be gained from sharing forces with other groups that have a kind of similar experience of being exposed to racism. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that on a couple of different levels. Let's start with like this, you know, theoretical framework of Black grammar. What I think we're trying to suggest is there are certain modes of resistance that are born out of a particular place and struggle. It's not just the U.S., like it was not just in the U.S. colonial, it was like so. But we don't understand Black grammar to be possessed or be possible only through people who are Black. Like in the UK, white people were tagging and tearing down statues too. So they were performing this kind of grammar. We're just naming it in a certain way, right? And in terms of US movement, the tension between Black and white and in organizing spaces has been there from the beginning. Whether there should be, to what extent should Black folks be organizing with white folks. In the beginning, you know, there's a kind of forced enclosure around Black people organizing with each other for those reasons. But since then, you know, whether it's people dealing with the NAACP all the way up to the Black Power movement and SNCC, and you know, the eventual expulsion of white folks within that organization. So there's always been a tension. But I think that people who are serious about movement and organizing and world building understand that they're you know, Black folks can't change the world on their own any more than immigrant movements can change the world without others, right? And so there's always going to be a back and forth between, you know, what ends can be achieved, you know, collectively just with, you know, Black folks, and when do we stand out? So there is a recognition of needing others for sure, and in the movement in the U.S., people are definitely trying to build a multi-generational, multiracial, multi-ethnic movement while still having Black-only spaces and initiatives that only Black folks are pushing forward or leading.
May I briefly add? And if Karen, if you're still there, it would be really nice if you can also jump in, because I think what we saw last year in the different forms of mobilization, so Black Lives Matter, there was a lot about in this movement, there's so much more than about debates about racism. And this was what I really liked of Christopher's presentation, making all these various facets and aspects visible now, which is connected to Blackness and things like that. And Black pride. And for example, it doesn't resonate a lot in the media, which is only focusing, as Karen said, they are calling up people from the movement and saying, oh, is there Black racism in Germany? And have you been discriminated in Germany? Please tell us. So this is continuously happening, but there is so much more within this movement shaping a particular identity. And then at the same time, there is so much more than in this anti-racist struggle than Black life activists or Black activists, which are part of a movement consisting of various other components. And I thought what happened since last 3 years, the idea, this unity within diversity, having this, we called it spirit of intersectionality, or this intersectional rootedness of this mobilization is really accepting all those different identities. So I think this is also different in terms of, okay, movements always have a master frame, or there were always movements of movements and allies coming together. But I think this older thing of we have to have a collective identity in a way weakened, or we have to have shared framing, apart from, okay, we do accept this huge diversity and referring to this in a way of intersectional spirit. And yeah. Karen, are you still with us, and would you like to add?
Okay, I think we have only 3 more minutes left in this session, so maybe we can take Nancy's question as the last one, and everyone can get a chance to say last words.
Thank you. So very interesting discussion overall. I wanted to introduce a few other issues with regard to some of the questions that were raised, particularly Jackie's question about why we talk about people differently in different countries. One thing I think to remind ourselves of is that in the emergence of nation states in Western Europe, the formulation of the nation state occurred through the effort to incorporate different political entities by homogenizing culture. And so there was an enforcement of common language, common customs, common ways of living, on the assumption that you could only hold together the political entity if there was a common sense of identity and loyalty to the state. But in that process, of course, we know the history of Western Europe in general is that they essentially externalized their exploitation and oppression through colonialism. So essentially oppressing and colonizing other parts of the world is partly what allowed Western states in Western Europe, or states in Western Europe, to provide certain kinds of freedoms to their own citizens because they were drawing resources from colonial places where they were exploiting people. Some people have talked about this as slavery and freedom or colonialism and freedom, and so that there's a political dynamic in that regard. In addition to that, there also is always a effort by dominant groups essentially to, as Zophia was talking about, to erase the notion of difference. There's a preference for thinking about colorblindness. Again, the sense that we're all one and that we're all together, even though we aren't, in fact, treated that way. And that is particularly relevant for French history because the Republican dimensions of the French Revolution essentially were to create a sense of Frenchness as opposed to internal differentiation. And I think that that is well discussed in a book by Michelle Lamont called The Dignity of Working Men, where she compares Black and white workers in the US with Black and white workers in France. And what she found was that in France, there was a strong sense that the differentiation was being French and not being Black versus white. Whereas, of course, in the US, that is not the case. So I don't know the extent to which that is relevant to other countries in Western Europe, but I think particularly those with very extensive colonial pasts, have a very complex history in terms of how they name people and how they recognize or make them visible. So I think that what we call people is always politically controversial, and that's one reason why these categories shift from time to time, because people try to escape stigmatizing categories and they rename themselves, and then that stigma attaches to the new categories, so that there is those kinds of dynamics going on as well. But it certainly is the case that in the history of white colonialism and the African slave trade, that there also is what Charles Mills calls epistemological ignorance, where whites in particular make a point to not know the history that they themselves have created. And that I love that phrase from him, epistemological ignorance, the essential decision of not knowing. And so, again, to some extent, when we try and talk about multicultural and multiracial context, it often becomes difficult because it's so frequently not recognized, either what the extent is or what the implications are. So I wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you.
If there is time, I think it's right what you are saying, but it doesn't explain the difference between France and the UK, or also the difference with the United States. Doesn't have the same type of history of colonialism, but as an history of slavery and an history of imperialism. So I think that there are still differences in the ways in which it is elaborated, and probably also the characteristics of the left and progressive forces is important when talking about, when trying to understand this in social movements, in the social movements area.
Thank you so much. I think we are now out of time, but this has been such a phenomenal and really important conversation and discussion. And, I really want to thank our presenters today for this really engaging space that you have created through your presentations. I also would really like to thank Sigrid Quack, our president of SASE, for stepping in to help organize this session today when I was unexpectedly unable to for a few months. So thank you so much, Sigrid. And SASE would also like to thank this year's virtual organizers, the KHK Center for Global Cooperation, in collaboration with the IAQ and the DIFIS. And you can find out more about these institutions by clicking on the homepage of the conference. But thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions that you're able to attend. And hopefully we can see each other in person next year.